Hello, you are welcome to Poli 214, Introduction to Comparative Politics. My name is Dr. Maami Jechijando, and I'm happy to take you through this first session. And so this is session 1 of Introduction to Comparative Politics, titled Understanding Comparative Politics. And in the overview, we want you to know that this introductory session is very important because it provides the foundation for the study of the other sessions. You'll become familiar in this session with the field of comparative politics, what politics is and what comparative politics is all about, and with some reasons why it is important to study this course. An understanding of what comparative politics is about will serve as a guide for understanding the remaining sessions in this course. The comparative method will also be introduced, as well as the debates in comparative politics, in order that you can study politics and political systems in a systematic and comparative manner. Now, we will first look at 4 topics in this session. The first topic will be what comparative politics is. What is comparative politics? Topic 2 will look at the comparative method. Topic 3, debates in comparative politics. And topic 4 will conclude. Please refer to your reading list. Essentials of Comparative Politics is the main text, but you are welcome to read other relevant texts, including the second text on the list. Topic 1, what is comparative politics? In order to understand comparative politics, we must first know what politics itself is all about. And simply put, politics is a struggle in any group for power that will give a person or people the ability to make decisions for the larger group. It is essentially the struggle for the authority to make decisions that will affect the people as a whole. Comparative politics is therefore a subfield of politics, you must remember, that compares the struggle across countries. So by studying a wide variety of countries, comparativists, as they are called, hope to shed light, to throw more light on countries and their political systems, as well as one's own political system. There are 5 fundamental questions in comparative politics that you must know. Comparativists consider these as they go about their work. First, how can political systems be compared? Second, comparativists ask, what are the limitations of the comparative method? The comparative method is used in comparing political systems, but what are the limitations? Third, how do institutions shape politics in various countries? Fourth, how do different countries reconcile the goals of freedom and equality? And then finally, can a political system achieve high levels of both freedom and equality? Now, there are a few questions here for you to address, to sample as you study. Now, to the question of why study comparative politics. It is necessary to study this course, to study comparative politics, because, first of all, we cannot ignore the outside world. We ignore the outside world at our own peril. There's a need to master the internal complexities of other countries and investigate patterns of politics around the world. This will enable us find out for ourselves the way in which other countries operate internally and how this may affect us. Secondly, we must also study comparative politics because by understanding politics in a comparative setting, we arm ourselves with the knowledge that is necessary for making informed decisions about our own lives. Thirdly, in comparative politics, political choices are based on very real examples and alternatives, not abstract ideas. So comparative politics, you must realize, has very practical and important applications. The comparative method. What is the comparative method in comparative politics? The comparative method is a means of making comparison across cases. And when we say cases, we mean countries in the world, across cases. It seeks to draw generalizations about politics that could be valid in other cases or countries. Now, this comparative method has certain key elements or characteristics. The first, we must remember that researchers using the comparative method seek to generalize about political phenomena from the study of some political systems or countries that may have certain things in common with other political systems or countries. For example, countries that have common histories, socioeconomic status, cultures, common cultures. If you are able to find countries or cases where there are commonalities in this sense, you can then generalize and assert that one's findings will also be valid or will also hold in these other cases. Secondly, researchers also seek to be able to establish causality or at least correlation between two or more variables or factors. When they are able to establish causality, their chances of generalizing about and predicting political phenomena are increased. Correlation, you must remember, however, is not causality. It just establishes that there is a strong relationship between two or more variables. Causality, on the other hand, is when a change in one variable causes change in another. For example, a researcher could decide to look at how economic prosperity, or the lack of it, can affect political stability. In this case, economic prosperity is the independent variable, while political stability is the dependent variable. Causality is established when a change in economic prosperity, for example, causes a change in political stability. The comparative method seeks to explain political phenomena, thirdly. For example, why some countries are democratic and others are not. Why some countries are developed and others underdeveloped. Why elections were successful in one country and unsuccessful in another country that has similar cultures, language, history. Fourth element of the comparative method is prediction. Comparativists seek to be able to predict phenomena about politics or political systems in different parts of the world. Fifth and finally, it is very important that whatever is studied and compared can be verified, and therefore the issue of verifiability is very important. Other researchers must be able to follow through one's methods and verify the methods by which the findings were arrived at. In a nutshell, there are 5 elements of the comparative method that all comparativists set out to achieve when engaging in research. Generalization and prediction are the 2 elements, however, that are difficult to achieve consistently, since they depend to a large extent on the establishment of causality. Now we move on to look at the quantitative and qualitative research methods in comparative politics. These are research methods that are used to carry out the comparative method. You can carry out the comparative method either in a quantitative way or in a qualitative way. Now, the qualitative research method relies on statistical data from a range of countries to construct hypotheses about politics. Hypotheses are simply educated guesses about something, some phenomena, and in this case, about politics. Researchers are able to draw from a large number of cases and control their variables more easily, but they are limited by those variables that can be expressed in quantitative terms and exist across a number of cases. The emphasis of the quantitative research method is on breadth over depth. That is, the ability to gather data on a large number of cases or countries, rather than on garnering in-depth information on a few cases or countries. The qualitative research method, on the other hand, stresses that one cannot truly understand a country or region unless one is steeped in its history and culture. Thus, this research method focuses much more on the unique aspects of countries. There is an emphasis on depth over breadth of cases or countries. So in other words, you do not necessarily want so many cases, but rather the in-depth knowledge of the particular country or countries. So we have quantitative methods providing broader analysis across regions and time, but qualitative methods giving us an in-depth knowledge of a country or countries. Unfortunately, there are some limitations of the comparative method. The first limitation has to do with establishing causality. Finding the cause of causality, unfortunately, is rarely easy because political scientists are unable to control the variables in all the cases they study. These cases are involving real countries and people. Secondly, comparative political scientists are unable to make true comparisons sometimes, since each case is quite different. At best, they might categorize countries on the basis of specific factors and control as much as possible for variables that might otherwise distort their conclusions. For example, if we want to understand why gun possession laws are so much less restrictive in the United States than in most other advanced countries, we could compare U.S. laws to laws in other countries that have similar historical, economic, political, and social experiences, like Canada and Australia. To continue, comparative political scientists are also often hampered or restricted by a limited number of cases because the number of countries in the world is less than 200. In addition, the number of cases is also limited by time. In other words, depending on whether one wants to study and compare countries that are democratic, for example, one may be limited to only a few cases or countries in the world that are without a doubt democratic. Fourthly, comparativists are limited in how they access the cases that are available to be studied. Few comparativists have the language skills, the time, or the resources to conduct field research in a number of countries. They thus often master knowledge of a single country, such as Ghana, for instance, instead, which limits the comparisons they can make. Sometimes they also compare different times and events or periods within the same country regarding some particular phenomenon or of politics. This is called time series analysis. For example, a researcher could take Ghana as a case, but have several cases to compare because he or she chooses to study the policies of different presidents in the different political administrations since independence in 1957. So, for example, the Nkrumah period versus the Akufo-Addo-Achampon-Rawlings periods. Here are some questions you definitely need to try your hands at and discuss amongst yourselves. Moving on to the third topic, debates in comparative politics. And here, we want to first look at the major contributions of philosophers to the field of comparative politics. The first philosopher we look at is Aristotle. Aristotle, I'm sure you've all heard about him, if not read some of his work, wrote his seminal work, The Politics. And in this book, he gathered and analyzed the constitutions of 158 Greek city-states and argued for an empirical science of politics with a practical purpose. Empirical just meaning observable, and verifiable. In other words, studying phenomena in politics that you could actually see and verify, practical things, okay? How to govern or statecraft, for example. Aristotle was the first to separate the study of politics from philosophy, and he's noted for that. Secondly, Niccolo Machiavelli, very famous scholar. In his major work, The Prince, Machiavelli, in his pragmatic or realistic fashion, highlighted the mechanics of government, diplomacy, military strategy, and power. He explained these mechanics of government in a systematic way. Like Aristotle, he emphasized statecraft, or how to govern, and empirical knowledge. He also analyzed different political systems, believing that these findings could be applied by statesmen and could be used by them to govern. Then we continue with Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who wrote the Leviathan, in which he advocated particular political systems based on empirical observation and analysis. He developed the notion of a social contract, where people surrender certain liberties in favor of order. Hobbes argued for a powerful state. John Locke argued in his two treatises of government, and mind you, John Locke was another English scholar who wrote the two treatises of government. And here he argued that private property is essential to individual freedom and prosperity. In contrast to Hobbes, however, Locke advocated a weak state rather than a powerful state that would not be able to encroach upon the rights and freedoms of its citizens. So if you compare and contrast Hobbes and Locke, you find that Hobbes wanted a powerful, strong state that could bring security and order to the people, while Locke thought that a strong state might encroach or might breach the rights and freedoms of the citizens. So he advocated a weak state. The fifth philosopher, important philosopher, who contributed to the field of comparative politics is Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu. In The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu, as he was called for short, studied the practical things in politics, government systems, and explained and argued for the separation of powers within government. If we talk about separation of powers within government in Ghana, for instance, or in any other country, you must remember that Montesquieu was the pioneer of this idea. And then sixth, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, in The Social Contract, argued, he was a French philosopher, argued that citizens' rights are inalienable. That is, they cannot be taken away or separated from, citizens' rights cannot be separated or taken away from them by the state. His work influenced the development of civil rights and therefore influenced the development of democracy. Karl Marx is our next philosopher, also another famous scholar. He developed a theory of economic development and inequality in his Das Kapital and predicted the eventual collapse of capitalism and democracy. Now, of course, this collapse has not happened yet. And then finally, we have Max Weber. Max Weber wrote Economy and Society, a German scholar and sociologist. He wrote The Economy and Society, where he elaborated on the concept of bureaucracy, forms of authority, and the impact that culture has or can have on economic and political development. We must also remember that comparative politics was greatly influenced also by modernization theory in the 1950s. Now, modernization theory argued that as societies developed, they would become capitalist democracies and would hold in common a shared set of values and characteristics. These values included achievement orientation as a promotion policy in society, rational scientific approach to tackling problems, and the promotion of individual freedoms and capitalist entrepreneurial spirit. You must note, however, that these theoretical assertions have not been fully proven in reality. So the question I have for you here is, what, in your view, are the two most important contributions by philosophers to the study of comparative politics, and why? Next, we move on to trends in comparative politics. And here, when we talk about trends in comparative politics, we just mean what have been the different approaches across time, over time, that comparative politics scholars have used. Different approaches have been dominant in comparative politics at different times. Three main approaches include: one, the traditional approach, which was dominant in the 19th to early 20th centuries. And this emphasized the description of political systems and their various institutions. For example, the description of the legislature in different countries, there is a description of the court system in different countries, a description of the executive branch of government in different countries. Secondly, the behavioral approach of the 1950s and 60s marked a shift from a descriptive study of politics to one that emphasized causality, explanation, and prediction. And if you remember correctly, these are elements, three key elements of the comparative method. So the behavioral approach placed greater emphasis on the political behavior of individuals as opposed to larger political structures or institutions, and on the quantitative research method rather than the qualitative research method. Modernization theory was predominant in this approach, and it was thought that eventually a grand theory of political behavior would be arrived at that would be valid across all countries. Then thirdly, the post-behavioral approach. This was dominant in the 1970s and onwards, and it's rejected basically the modernization theory's grand approach to politics as biased and inaccurate. This approach instead emphasized a diversity of political approaches depending on what the research was about, and emphasized the importance of research on issues of gender, culture, the environment, and globalization, for example. The post-behavioral approach has been quite dominant since the 1980s, you should note. So the question I have here for you, it's an easy question. State briefly the difference between the traditional approach and the behavioral approach to the study of comparative politics. And so now we have the conclusion of this session. In this session, you have been introduced to the concept of comparative politics, as well as why it is important that everyone study some aspect of it. In addition, you have learned about the comparative method and the quantitative and qualitative research methods, which are different ways of approaching research using the comparative method. The significant contributions of philosophers to the study and method of comparative politics have also been highlighted, as well as some of the main approaches to the study of the field. You have learned that different approaches have been more dominant at different times since the 19th century. In the next session, we shall take a look at some of the new global developments that shocked most comparativists beginning in the 1980s. We shall also look at political institutions as a guiding approach to the study of comparative politics, and reconciling freedom and equality, a guiding idea. Please also refer to the reference list at the end of the session. Thank you very much.